Gerardine Clifford is the Chief Executive Officer of the Taeaomanino Trust. At nearly 20 years of age, the Trust is one of the oldest and biggest bi-Pacific for Pacific social service providers in New Zealand. With a Pacific staff base of 27 full-time equivalent staff and 18 active volunteers, the Trust makes a significant contribution to the economic development of Pacific people in Porirua. Gerardine also serves on the board of Barnados, was recently appointed to the Wellington Community Trust and is a mentor for the Pacifica Medical Association. She has a Master's in Business Administration. Please welcome Gerardine Clifford.
Malo e lelei, whakalofa lahi atu, kia orana, taloha ni sa bulivinaka, o te whaatalofa atu, i le paia ma le mamalu o leo awhia, wa potu maili nei aso, o te whaatalofa pitoa atu, i le tangata whenua i Aotearoa nei, kia ora. And warm Pacific greetings from the depth of benefit dependency. It's a great pleasure to provide you with some reflections over the last 2 days, and I guess what has been glaringly obvious to me from the outset is the lack of Pacific and Māori participation here. And I guess this is a problem because we form such a significant part of the picture, not the problem but the picture, and even more so, we will be forming a very big part of the future picture. And I want to make it clear that I'm not making a dig at the organisers or the working group, because to do that would not be doing justice to the issues. And that approach, I think, is far too shallow. I think we heard yesterday that in the 60s, New Zealand on average had 4.2 children in the family. And today it's got 2 children. And in fact, the Pacific community today still has an average of about 4 children. And for some of us, more high-performing, my Tongan whānau, for example, have an even higher rate than that. And Pacific people often ask me, why do Pacific people have so many children when clearly they can't afford them? And it's because we have a very different measure of wealth. Material wealth doesn't mean anything to us, and particularly for migrant and first-generation Pacific people. The wealth comes from the richness of legacy, ngafa or whakapapa, your heritage. And in saying that, the more children you have, the richer you are. So we see it as an investment in our retirement. It's Pacific strategic planning. And I remember when I turned 28, my mother rang me and said, "Happy birthday, Gerardine." And she used Samoan word tālowhai, which means you poor thing, 28 and still no children. And I knew then that I'd passed the threshold from being a youth to an old person, because she stopped saying to me, "Don't come home pregnant." and this is despite the fact that my partner at the time was a real dropkick. So what was more important to her was that I was creating a legacy. The demography and growth of the Pacific population indicates that many people in this room are going to have Pacific grandchildren or great-grandchildren. And you may find that alarming, but don't worry, there are some Pacific people who are equally alarmed at the thought of having a family that have got palangis in it. And what I'm trying to point out is that as a society we should be taking joint responsibility for Pacific and Māori participation. Otherwise the imbalance that we see here today is only going to be perpetuated further in the future. And what we've heard here highlights the complexities of the welfare system. It's bigger than cutting benefits, although the more cynical of us believe that it is all about cutting benefits. In one session we hear about the poor achievement rates of Māori and Pacific and youth, while in other sessions we've heard that it's all to do about the education system and its failure to acknowledge the ability of our children. We've talked about the plight of the beneficiary, that they are the victims of a deficient and unproductive economy, which gives people who want to work few opportunities to work. What stands out for me is the issue of long-term unemployment. And I see the guilt, the shame, the fear, helplessness, failure, rejection, anxiety and humiliation that goes along with this. And it's right about now that I can feel the economists going, those damn social service do-gooders. But what I want to point out is the rate of decline into despair for Pacific people happens at a much faster rate, particularly for our men. So while they might be big and burly, in actual fact they're real gentle, sensitive creatures. And at the 26-week long-term unemployment threshold, you're actually dealing with the same symptoms of probably 4 years unemployment. And we call it dependency like it's the fault of the beneficiary to be dependent. May I remind you that the other side to dependency is addiction, the creation of a society of benefit addicts, a behavioural addiction where, unlike other addictions, there is no feel-good factor. And we don't call it addiction because it's far more palatable to call it a dependency and lay the blame at the feet of the dependent rather than the feet of the enablers. So what I'm saying is that if you're a young person, a young Pacific person with a disability and male, your pathway to benefit addiction is almost predetermined. And I want to talk about some of the enablers that we've seen over the last 2 days.